Most people think spiritual awakening is the moment everything finally makes sense, like you reach some finish line, like the search ends and life suddenly becomes clear. But Jung discovered something most people never talk about. Awakening isn't the arrival, it's the door opening. What comes after, what the ancients called Sophia, is when you stop seeking, not because you gave up, but because something in you finally settled. Sophia is not about being enlightened, it's not about being healed, and it's definitely not about being better than anyone else. Sophia is the stage where you stop trying to become something and start living as who you already are, where your inner and outer lives finally stop fighting each other, where nothing needs to be proven. Jung would say this is not spiritual achievement, it's psychological maturity. And it only comes after you've faced yourself deeply and often without realizing that's what you were doing. The signs of this stage don't look impressive, but once you recognize them, you can't unsee them. In this video, you'll discover 8 signs that suggest you've already reached this state. These signs aren't a checklist to tick off. They're resonances, vibrations that either echo in you or remain silent. Then are you ready to recognize that you might already be where you've always wanted to go? Sign 1. The wound no longer bleeds. The first sign isn't that your wounds are gone. They're still there, exactly where they've always been. You remember what happened. You remember how it shaped you. You remember the version of yourself that didn't know how to carry it yet. But when you look back now, your body doesn't flinch. There's no sharp contraction, no emotional reflex pulling you into the past. The story exists, but it doesn't demand to be relived. The pain didn't disappear. It changed its role. What once controlled your reactions now sits quietly in the background. It no longer defines how you see yourself or how you interpret the world. It's part of your history, not the lens you're trapped inside. Think of a tree struck by lightning. The mark remains in the bark for decades, but the tree continues to grow around it. The wound becomes part of the structure, not a threat to it. Carl Jung described this as shadow integration, not the act of repairing something broken, and not the fantasy of erasing darkness. It's the moment you recognize that the parts of you you once resisted were never mistakes. They were responses. They formed when you needed them. And they stayed until you were ready to understand what they carried. At this stage, the inner conflict softens. You're no longer arguing with yourself, trying to prove that you're healed or worthy. The voices that once questioned your value begin to lose their urgency. Not because you forced them into silence, but because you finally listened long enough to hear what they were protecting. This is when the wound becomes a scar. It remains visible, but it no longer dictates your movement, and instead of pulling you backward, it stands as quiet evidence of something simple and profound. You survived, and you don't need to fight yourself anymore. Sign 2. The spiritual ego falls away. The second sign is easy to overlook because nothing dramatic happens. There's no breakthrough moment, no announcement inside you. Just a subtle shift in what no longer feels important. The spiritual identity you once carried begins to loosen its grip. You stop caring about being awake, about being healed, conscious, or further along than anyone else. Not because you've rejected spirituality, but because the labels feel strangely hollow now. They don't describe your experience anymore, they don't add anything, and they don't ask to be defended. You notice this most clearly around other people. You no longer compare paths or measure depth. You're not scanning conversations for signs of who's evolved and who isn't. There's no internal ranking system running in the background. And without trying to be humble, you also stop needing to be recognized. If someone sees you as wise, it doesn't move you. If they misunderstand you, it doesn't disturb you either. Your sense of self no longer depends on being seen a certain way. You can sit with someone who's just beginning their inner journey and feel completely at ease. There's no urge to correct them or guide them forward, no subtle impatience, no sense that you should intervene. You understand something now that can't be learned from books. Growth has its own timing. Awareness unfolds at the pace it needs to. And interfering with that process doesn't help, it intrudes. What once looked like compassion, you now recognize as control, and what once felt like teaching, you see more clearly as reassurance for the ego. So you let people walk their paths without commentary, you remain present without instruction, and in that quiet restraint, the spiritual ego dissolves, not through effort, but because it's no longer needed. What remains isn't identity, it's simplicity. Sign 3. The body becomes the compass. At this stage, wisdom stops living in your thoughts. It settles somewhere deeper. You no longer need constant confirmation from outside yourself. You don't ask endlessly for signs, advice, or reassurance. Your body begins to speak clearly, and you've learned how to listen. When something is wrong, you don't need to analyze it. There's a subtle tightening, a heaviness that wasn't there before, a quiet resistance that shows up before words ever do, and when something is right, the signal is just as clear. Your breath deepens without effort, your shoulders drop, your system settles into itself. There's no excitement rush, no dramatic certainty, just a calm internal yes. You stop chasing elevated states because you no longer confuse intensity with truth. And you stop fearing low states because you understand they're not failures. Restlessness passes, stillness passes, energy comes and goes. None of it threatens your sense of balance anymore. You begin to recognize that contraction isn't a problem to fix, it's information. And expansion isn't something to cling to, it's simply another phase in the rhythm. Earlier, you may have tried to rise above the body, to outthink it, to transcend it in the name of growth. Now you see that real integration moves in the opposite direction, downward, into sensation, into presence. The body is no longer something you manage or override. It becomes an ally, a quiet guide that responds honestly to what aligns and what doesn't. You don't force yourself forward anymore. You notice when something pulls you open and when it closes you down. And instead of arguing with those signals, you trust them. This is the return to embodiment, not as a practice, but as a way of being. You are no longer trying to escape the body. You have come home to it. Sign 4. Solitude becomes fullness. One of the most misunderstood signs of Sophia is the way your relationship with solitude changes. From the outside, it can look like withdrawal, as if you've stepped back from the world, as if something disappointed you. But that's not what's happening. You're not avoiding people. You're not retreating out of fear or exhaustion. You're simply no longer fragmented when you're alone. Being alone doesn't feel like something you have to endure. It doesn't feel like waiting for life to begin again. It feels like room. Room to exist without adjusting yourself to anyone else's expectations. Room to move through your day without negotiating your inner state. A kind of quiet that doesn't ask anything from you. Earlier in life, solitude may have felt uncomfortable. It might have amplified restlessness or uncertainty. So you filled it, often without realizing that's what you were doing. You stayed busy, you stayed connected, you stayed engaged enough to avoid sitting too closely with yourself. Now that impulse has softened. You no longer use relationships to stabilize your sense of identity. You don't seek connection to escape inner emptiness. When you choose closeness now, it comes from a place that is already settled. This changes the quality of connection. You can enjoy intimacy without losing your center. You can step back without anxiety. You don't confuse emotional intensity with depth. Carl Jung described this shift as existential self-sufficiency, not isolation, not emotional distance, but the end of searching for yourself through another person. You don't need to be reflected back to feel real. You don't rely on presence to confirm your worth. Your sense of wholeness stands on its own. Solitude is no longer something to fear. It becomes a stable ground beneath you, and from that ground, every relationship is entered freely, not to complete you, but to meet you. Sign 5. The will transforms. At this stage, something subtle changes in the way you act. Your will is still there. You still make choices. You still move, create, and participate in the world. But the force behind your actions is no longer the same. Earlier in life, much of what you did was driven by lack. You were trying to become enough, trying to secure meaning, trying to force life to confirm your value. Even when you succeeded, the tension remained, because the action wasn't coming from alignment, it was coming from hunger. Now, that hunger has quieted. You're no longer trying to manifest worth through effort. You don't push outcomes as proof that you matter. You act, but there's no clenched urgency behind the movement. Action begins to feel like expression. You do what feels right to do without over-attaching to where it leads. You give your energy where it naturally wants to flow. And when something no longer responds, you don't double down out of fear. You pause, you adjust, you let go. Success stops carrying the weight it once did. Failure no longer threatens your identity. Neither one defines who you are. This doesn't make you passive. You still care, you still show up. But you're no longer swimming against the current, exhausting yourself just to prove you can survive. There's a growing trust that life doesn't need to be conquered. It needs to be met. I once spoke with someone who said, "I realized my will had changed when I stopped needing things to work out a certain way." They still pursued what mattered, but failure no longer felt like collapse. It felt like information. That's the sign. You begin to sense when to move forward and when to step back, when effort is appropriate, and when restraint is wiser. This discernment doesn't come from strategy, it comes from presence. Your will no longer imposes itself on life, it listens first. And in that listening, action becomes lighter, more precise, less burdened by the need to control what happens next. You're not drifting, you're participating without force. This is what it feels like when will stops fighting life and starts moving with it. Sign 6. Time loses its authority. At this stage, something quiet happens to your relationship with time. The pressure of when begins to loosen. Not all at once, not dramatically. Just enough for you to notice that certain thoughts no longer carry the same weight. The future stops acting like a destination you must reach in order to feel complete. You're no longer telling yourself that peace will arrive later, once something finally resolves. Life is no longer on hold. You stop postponing yourself. The past changes as well. It no longer feels like a place you need to defend against or revisit in order to understand. You can remember without being pulled backward. What happened still matters, but it no longer argues with the present. It has its place, and that place no longer demands your energy. The future too begins to soften. You don't require certainty in order to move forward. You don't need guarantees before taking the next step. The demand to know how everything will turn out slowly fades. This doesn't make you careless, it makes you grounded. Think of a long road trip. For years, you were fixated on the destination, convinced that peace existed only when you arrived. Then one day, You notice the view out the window. The movement itself becomes enough. You understand something now that can't be rushed into awareness. Peace is not waiting at the end of a long sequence of events. It doesn't arrive once you've earned it through endurance or effort. Peace exists only where you are. And for the first time, you're actually here. Presence is no longer something you practice in moments of discipline. It's not a technique you return to when things feel unstable. It becomes your default state. You respond instead of react. You move without racing ahead of yourself. Time still passes, but it no longer controls you. There's a growing trust that whatever comes can be met from this place. Not because you know what will happen, but because you know where you are. And where you are is enough. The path doesn't lead to peace anymore. It is peace, experienced one moment at a time. Sign 7. Compassion without the savior. At this stage, your compassion changes shape. You still feel deeply. You still notice pain when it appears. But you no longer absorb it as something you're meant to carry. Earlier in life, compassion may have felt heavy. You felt responsible for easing discomfort, offering answers, stepping in before things fell apart. Helping often came with urgency and sometimes with exhaustion. Now, something has shifted. You no longer rush to fix what isn't yours to fix. You don't rescue people from experiences they need to move through themselves. You don't interfere simply to relieve your own discomfort with witnessing pain. This doesn't make you distant, it makes you clear. I once spoke with a woman who had spent years carrying everyone else's emotional weight, family, partners, friends. She believed love meant saving. Then one day she said, "I realized I wasn't helping anymore, I was interrupting." When she stopped intervening, something surprising happened. People didn't collapse, they grew. That was the turning point. You've learned that every person has a process that can't be outsourced. Growth unfolds in its own way, often through moments that look difficult from the outside. Interrupting that process, even with good intentions, can take something essential away. Jung believed that the greatest form of disrespect is assuming you know what another soul needs. At this stage, that understanding settles into your body. You listen without preparing solutions. You stay present without trying to steer the outcome. You allow others their dignity even when their path looks uncertain. Your help becomes quieter. You offer space instead of advice. You remain steady instead of persuasive. You trust that people will find what they're ready to find, and something unexpected happens. Your presence begins to do what your words use to try to accomplish. People feel calmer around you without knowing why. They speak more honestly, not because you guide them, but because you're not trying to direct them. You don't teach anymore. There's nothing to transmit. What you carry now is coherence, and that coherence speaks on its own. Compassion at this level is no longer about saving anyone. It's about honoring the intelligence of life as it moves through each person, including you. Sign 8. The ordinary becomes sacred. The final sign is the quietest of all, so quiet that many people overlook it entirely. Life becomes ordinary, not dull, not empty, just ordinary. And somehow that ordinariness begins to feel complete. You no longer search for peak experiences. You're not chasing moments that promise transcendence or intensity. The hunger for something extraordinary softens on its own. Daily life moves at a simpler pace. You wash dishes without rushing through it. You walk without needing it to lead anywhere special. You notice your breath without trying to deepen or control it. Nothing dramatic happens in these moments. And that's the point. They carry the same depth that once seemed reserved for rituals or revelations. Not because life suddenly became meaningful, but because you stopped overlooking it. Earlier, you may have believed that the sacred existed somewhere else. in special states, in rare insights, in moments that stood apart from the rest of your life. Now that separation dissolves. There's no hierarchy between the spiritual and the practical anymore. No sense that some moments matter more than others. What's happening right now is enough. You also notice something else has faded. There's no audience. You're no longer narrating your growth to yourself or anyone else. You're not measuring how awake you appear. You're not performing meaning. Life is no longer a stage. It's simply being lived. And in that simplicity, something settles deeply. The need to be seen relaxes. The need to be understood loosens its grip. You don't feel smaller because of this. You feel free. The sacred doesn't announce itself anymore. It doesn't require recognition. It's present in the way you move through the day without resistance, in the way nothing needs to be added or taken away. This is not the end of the journey. It's the moment you stop leaving your life in order to find it. Nothing extraordinary is happening, and for the first time, that's exactly enough. Sophia is not something you reach. It's not a destination, and it's not a reward. It's what remains when you stop running from yourself. Nothing was won. Nothing about you became extraordinary. What changed was simpler than that. You stopped fighting. You stopped arguing with your own nature. You stopped trying to correct yourself into someone else. And in that stopping, something quietly came into view. Not a new identity. Not a higher version of you. Just what was always there, waiting without urgency. If these words resonate, it doesn't mean you've achieved anything. It doesn't mean you're further along than others. It means you allowed something to surface without forcing it. Something familiar, something honest. The wisdom was never missing. It was covered by effort, by seeking, by the need to become. And when those layers fell away, nothing dramatic appeared, only clarity. So the question isn't whether you've reached Sophia. That question belongs to the mind that's still measuring. The real question is quieter. Are you willing to see yourself as you are, without the stories you've been telling, without the roles you've learned to play, without the endless search for what comes next? Just this moment, just you here. And for once, that's enough.